Good morning, church. So as we are rapidly approaching the end of June, we're heading into July, we are in the midst of summer. Now, for many, summer is their favorite season. I have to believe it's because they've been psychologically tricked as children into looking forward to it because there's no school, when in actuality you realize it's just hot and humid, and fall is much better. But for many, summer is it's the best time of the year. For kids, it means school is finally done, at least for a short couple of months. It means they get to just sleep in and play video games all day. It means they get to go to church camp. I know TRCC is just around the corner. It means they get to, maybe they have different sport camps they've got, or family vacations, and there's all of these super exciting things. Come on. For those who love being outdoors, it just means maybe the window for when you can get out to go camping and hiking or golfing or kayaking or whatever that outdoor activity is, you just have a better chance to do it in the summer. We look forward to summer because summer seems to have a lot of change. Years ago, when I was in college, I just remember having this, what felt like over and over my first 2 years at Harding, this conversation with all these different students about if people liked change or not. You know, like, are you someone who likes change? And I just remember that it would be like you'd get to college as a freshman and you can try on all these different versions of yourself because you don't have to be who you were in the junior high and high school. You can be someone new because you're in a new place. And one of the outfits that felt like everyone would try was, you know what, I'm going to be spontaneous and just embrace the possibility of being able to do whatever. And then you plan nothing because you're embracing the change. And some people appear to like it. Others, like myself, are like, I do not like change at all. I want to do the same thing every single day, every single week, and have the same exact routine. Let's keep it nice and steady. And I only like change if it is something that I have personally planned for. And that's stretching the definitions of change. If I've already said, you know what, I'm going to adjust everything for this, then I like change. When something gets sprung on me suddenly that throws off my routines, I shut down for. I'm looking at Taylor for a minute. I shut down for a while. I get grouchy, to put it mildly. I do not like change, even in its mildest of forms. And of course, I think lots of us don't like change, especially when we know that the change that is coming, we don't perceive to be a good thing, right? Maybe there was a merger in our work and we just know that there is going to be something happening with our job situation, and we just are dreading that. Maybe as kids, you have just finished off this awesome time in junior high, and you're not very excited for high school, and you're just dreading this new opportunity. I know for those who just recently graduated high school or heading off to the next big thing, whether it's college or backpacking in Peru for a year or whatever it is, for the families, there's some excitement, but there's also a lot of dread with the change. And that's not even going to take all the things that are suddenly sprung on us that are just horrible, gut-wrenching things that disrupt our entire lives. And so as we are in this season, summer, what is quite literally a season of all this different change happening in all these different ways, I started to think about how do we, as Christians, how do we as people of God respond to change, and especially when it's not something good, right? Because I think when change is good, like I just got a promotion at work, well, that's super easy. That's super exciting. It's invigorating. But when something happens, maybe I suddenly lost my job, or maybe X, Y, or Z happened and it's not good. How do we respond to that? And so today we're going to be looking at the example of Nehemiah. Now, I am fully aware that Nehemiah is probably, I don't have any statistics behind this, but in terms of books that get read the most, I would venture to guess that Nehemiah is bottom 10. I'm going to guess to say it's, I don't know if you've ever perused through just the headings of the book of Nehemiah. I'm reading from the NIV 1984 edition, but all the little headers throughout the book of Nehemiah are all going to be relatively similar. It starts off with Nehemiah's prayer, so you could be understanding, okay, this seems like a good start. And then you look and it says he's inspecting Jerusalem's walls. Now they're building walls. There's opposition to rebuilding the walls. There's more opposition to building walls. He completes the walls. There seems to be an awful lot about fixing a wall. What does this have to do with change? And I'm glad you asked that, because we're going to get there. But in order for us to fully understand what is happening with this little book that churches don't spend too much time on, we have to back up a little bit further. So I'm going to encourage you on your Bibles or on your phones or whatever to go to 2 Chronicles chapter 36, because we need to set the context for what is happening, not only for what that is happening in the book of Nehemiah to make sense just story-wise, but also for them to make sense, what does this have to do with us in 2023 Connecticut? So we're going to be in 2 Chronicles chapter 36. If you've read through 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, these historical books are chronicling the rise and fall of the kingdoms of Judah and Israel and all their various kings, both good and bad, who have served. Some of the kings get more time dedicated to them than others, but what the authors have done is they point out, hey, this person was a good king, or hey, this person was not a good king. And that gives us a pretty good idea. And so if you were to read in 2 Chronicles, right before chapter 36, it's talking about King Josiah. Now, if you're familiar with Josiah, and if you're not, Josiah became king when he was 8 years old. So just look around, or think about our kids who just went back who are 8, and just imagine them running our country. Josiah became king when he was 8 years old, and he starts off okay. Later, they discover the book of the law, and thus begins this whole new time frame for the kingdom where Josiah is having the book of the law reintroduced to the Jewish people, and there is reform happening all over the kingdom, and Josiah is to be deemed a good king. Now, he ultimately ends up dying because he gets in a fight with the king of Egypt, and God really says, hey, you shouldn't fight the guy. Instead, Josiah then dresses up as a soldier in disguise and then gets shot by an archer and dies. So, I mean, a little bit of a tragic death, but he is commemorated and he is known to be a good king, one who was faithful to God, one who restored the book of the law back to God's people. It says right at the end of verse 35, it says, Jeremiah, the prophet we're familiar with, composed laments for Josiah, and to this day all the men and women singers commemorate Josiah in the laments. These became a tradition, and it says, Josiah's reign and his acts of devotion were all recorded, written in the law of the Lord. And the people of the land took Jehoahaz, son of Josiah, and made him the king in his place. Now, I like looking for patterns. Typically what happens is if there is a good king, his son, not so much. So Jehoahaz becomes king, and he's king for 3 months. And then the king of Egypt dethrones him and takes him off to Egypt and places his brother, Eliakim, who then gets renamed to Jehoiakim, and makes Jehoiakim king. And then if you look in verse 5 of verse 36, it says, Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king. He reigned for 11 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So we are followed by Josiah, by an evil king. Eventually, Jehoiakim's son becomes king. And in verse 9, it says, Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 3 months and 10 days. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Then Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon takes Jehoiakim with him, along with all of the articles of the temple, back to Babylon, and makes Zedekiah king over Judah and Jerusalem. And in verse 11, it says, Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. And he did evil in the eyes of the Lord his God, and did not humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet, who spoke the word of the Lord. And so we are immediately followed by a strand of three kings who have done evil in the eyes of the Lord. And thus begins this domino effect where Nebuchadnezzar swoops in. He brings all of the Jewish people into exile, and they crush and they burn the city of Jerusalem. And we are thus into the 70-year period of exile where the Jewish people are in Babylon and just completely taken away, uprooted from their home. What I want us to focus on is this last about 5 verses or so of verse 36. So this sets the stage for the book of Nehemiah. So beginning in verse 20, this is talking about Nebuchadnezzar here. It says, Nebuchadnezzar, he carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his sons until the kingdom of Persia came to power. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation it rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and to put it in writing. It says, this is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heavens, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any one of his people among you, may the Lord his God be with him and let him go up. The SparkNote version is after 70 years in Babylonian captivity, Persia becomes the new superpower on top in this region, and they become the king of Persia. Cyrus becomes convicted to let the Jewish remnant go back to Jerusalem. And this begins 3 different waves of the Jewish people returning to Jerusalem. Now, the book of Ezra, immediately after 2nd Chronicles, before Nehemiah, this tells a story of the first 2 waves. We're not going to really talk about Ezra much, but also an incredible and fantastic book. I encourage you to spend some time reading in Ezra. But Ezra tells the story of the first 2 waves, and then Nehemiah follows with the 3rd and final way of the Jewish remnant going back to Jerusalem. And this is where we're going to begin, is in chapter 1 of Nehemiah. And to let you know, we're going to spend bulk of our time in the book of Nehemiah in the first 2 chapters, and then we'll hit some spots later throughout the book before the meat of our time together is going to be in this first 2 chapters. So we're starting in chapter 1 of Nehemiah, verse 1. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah and some other men, and I questioned with them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. Nehemiah has been still with the Persian government, in Persia, while his family has already returned to Jerusalem. They have come back to visit, and he is catching the details because he knows nothing about what has happened in Jerusalem, right? There's been rumors, sure, but what the specific details, they don't have a report of everything that's gone, and he's asking about them. And it says, they said to me, those who survived the exile are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. I think all of us at one point or another can really relate with Nehemiah when we have heard news of change in our lives that is utterly destroying, that is wrecking us and is ruining us. I don't think we necessarily always appreciate the architectural and geographical structure of Jerusalem because we don't really have walls in our modern era today. We don't have a wall around Manchester to protect us from the folks in Vernon or to protect us from the folks in Glastonbury or hard-hitting New Britain or anything, right? But part of the beauty and the majesty of Jerusalem and part of its strategic advantage for all the years where they were fighting off attacks was the walls of Jerusalem. That was this safety and this harbor for the people of God to find refuge in, to protect them from outside forces. And Nehemiah has just heard the news that the remnant there are there in disgrace, and the walls have all been burned and destroyed. And I find it so powerful that Nehemiah, when he first hears these things, he sits down and he weeps. He mourns over the brokenness of his people. He mourns over the brokenness of his home. He doesn't immediately rush to action, but he just sits and he mourns and grieves. It tells us that he would go on to pray, and that he gives us a detail of this prayer that he says before God, which I find so powerful given the context we've established in 2 Chronicles. It says, beginning in verse 5, "O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love and with those who love him and obey his commands, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's house, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you, and we have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses." I want to pause here because we talked about how the last three kings of Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord. And it's one of those things throughout human history. If you look at kingdoms and countries all across the world and throughout history, depending on how well the leader, the king or prime minister, whoever the main person in charge is, how they behave tends to have a ripple effect across the rest of the population, right? In places where the leader has been cruel and evil and wicked, generally the people of that population have followed. And so the last three kings all did evil in the sight of the Lord, but so did the inhabitants of Jerusalem at the time. They have all committed evil and wickedness. And Nehemiah is just, he's confessing it from the get-go. God, you know that I have sinned, my father's house has sinned, and our people have sinned against you. It says, remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was cupbearer to the king. So we see this kind of outline, this steps that have happened is Nehemiah has heard the news about the destruction of his homeland and about the disgrace his people, and he has fallen down, he has grieved, and he has wept for days, and then he falls before God and says, God, we have sinned against you. We have sinned and we have been wicked, but I remember what you said in the book of the law, that if we return to you, you will restore us in your place. So God, what he is saying is, I have a plan. Please guide me. Please back me up. Please give me favor in the eyes of this man who he is referring to, the king that he is cupbearer to. The thing I love about Nehemiah is that he wasn't a priest. He wasn't one of the prophets. He wasn't a quote unquote spiritual leader of his people. He was a royal official and what we might call a secular position who was just overwhelmed by the burden of his own people. He was cupbearer to the king. We kind of know throughout some of the other stories of the Old Testament, I'm thinking of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and other folks, that in order for for the Israelites to be a high official in a foreign power, it had to say something about who they were as a person, right? Like they weren't just picking some average Joe Israelite to be cupbearer to the king. It's because that person must have demonstrated something to that foreign power, that they were a person of noble and upright character, to give them some sort of credibility to say, hey, this Israelite, we are going to appoint him as the cupbearer to the king. That has to say something about who he is for a captive person to be appointed such. And so he gives us this hint. He says, I was cupbearer to the king. And in chapter 2, he begins to make preparations to make his pitch to the king of Persia at the time. It says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. And so I want you to picture this as we read along, as we have Nehemiah, he's bringing the cup to the king. And you can see, I think we've all have either experienced this or seen this when someone that we love and know dearly has had to come face to face with something tragic. We see that take a weight on them. You see it on their bodies. Some of you may be like me. I wear every single emotion on my sleeve. I have zero poker face of any sort. I wear emotions on my sleeve. When something is weighing on me, it is evident. Nehemiah has never been sad in the presence of the king before. And the king asks him, he says, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of the heart. So first, I'll give credit to the king for just even recognizing that his cupbearer, this Israelite, not even one of his people, is sad. And he says, you're clearly not sick, right? You're healthy. You seem to be fine. So the sadness can only be something of the heart. What is it that you want? He says, I was very much afraid, rightfully so, always the risk of being beheaded or killed by said king. I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it you want? And then Nehemiah says, then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried so that I can rebuild it. Then the king with the queen sitting beside him asked me, how long will your journey take, and when will you get back? And it pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. Nehemiah then, he begins to work this plan to go back to Jerusalem, to begin rebuilding the walls. And while he still has the favor of the king, he asks him for, hey, can I get letters of bearing your seal so that as I pass through land, I can get through some no problem? Because even though you are king and you control all of this land and territory, there's going to be plenty of folks who do not want to see Jerusalem rebuilt or restored in any sort of way. And he begins to gather the necessary documents in order to make right this change, to begin to adapt and rebuild. After he arrives into Jerusalem, he hasn't told a soul what he is doing, really. And it says, picking up in verse 11, I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few men. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night, I went out through the valley gate toward the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me and what the king has said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, these are guys who are categorically opposed to any restoration of Jerusalem. They heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you're doing? They asked. Are you rebelling against the king? And I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. And thus begins the rest of the book of Nehemiah, is the chronicling the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls, this pinnacle part of the city, and the opposition that Nehemiah faces from both outsiders and from inside the city walls. And at this point, you're probably asking, but still, what does this have to do with us? Because I'm not going out and, unless you're in masonry, most of us aren't going out and actually building any sort of walls. What does this have to do with us? We have all, on every level, individually, family, and as a larger society, have all experienced change that has been debilitating and that has been negative and that has been detrimental to what we deem to be good. Again, we've all had that personally. Job, family, who knows, right? We've all had that within our greater family. And as I think about greater society as a whole, this is really where my tends to drift to. You know, it wasn't too long ago where the primary ideology of the United States of America was at least mostly kind of aligned with Christian values, right? They weren't the same, but at least we're kind of on the same general path. And so we could almost look to the greater culture to at least kind of get people going in the same direction as us. And then things have changed, and now there's all these different worldviews and ideologies, and now it's all just this big tangled mess, and we are trying to still go in the direction of God. And I think there's times where we lament that what is happening with people, right? We all used to be at least going the somewhat same direction, but now it seems like we're all over the map. What do we do? Well, I think to look at the example of Nehemiah, we grieve and we mourn that. We mourn that our culture is no longer, if you want to quote unquote say, naturally conducive to Christ, however you want to phrase that, we just mourn that, right? Our culture, or better put, cultures within our country are for the most part going in the opposite direction of what Christ and God call us to. And I think the sooner we acknowledge that the states that we are in and that the people that we love and care about and we live and work with are in, the sooner we can just grieve that this is the situation we find ourselves in. All right, it's okay to mourn that. I think about, I have cousins in my family who are not in God, Christ-like environments, and they are raising kids. And I have friends who are no longer in Christ-like environments who are now welcoming kids into this world. And I think about what they are growing up in and they are maturing in and how it's not Christ-oriented. And I grieve that because it's just, it's hard and it's not good and it's not right. And it's okay to mourn about the states that we find ourselves in. The thing we can't do, and this is what I appreciate from the example of Nehemiah, is we can't just sit in our grief and mourning forever, right? Nehemiah, eventually, he turns to God and asks for God for his guidance and his wisdom, and he begins to make a plan. But the other thing Nehemiah doesn't do as well is he's not pointing fingers at anyone. He is not, if you read throughout the book, not once he's saying those darn Babylonians had to come through and run, or if only, so-and-so hadn't been much this, he's not pointing the finger and casting blame. He is just simply saying, this is what we are in. We have contributed to it through our own sin. Now, God, help us get through it. And so as we begin to think about our own negative change, both personal, familial, and societally, we mourn and then we say, God, I've contributed to this in some form or fashion. It's just, I have. And God, I'm asking for your forgiveness and I'm asking for your guidance. And then all throughout, we begin to make moves and plans to restore things. To renew them to back how they were. And now we are very incredibly fortunate that Jesus has already come and has done the bulk of the legwork of restoration and renewal for us. And he is inviting us into that. And so our call then is to say, God, how can I help you in restoring what has happened here? Whatever that is for, that you are immediately thinking of. How can I be a part of rebuilding what that you have deemed to be good? We're no longer interested in rebuilding a physical Jerusalem, right? Or as our brother said at communion, we're no longer necessarily concerned about our focus is rebuilding some physical structure that we call the church, right? But we are about restoring the kingdom of God. And just saying, God, how can I be a part of that? It's easy when we see the change as being good, right? I think, for example, we have Randall coming in just, 4 weeks. And it's easy to say that's exciting because look at this good bit of change that is happening. And it's easy to say, isn't this awesome? Because there's this excitement. It's something that we've planned for, that we have anticipated. But what do we do when change that we did not welcome comes knocking at the door? How do we respond to that? I encourage you to find solace in the example of Nehemiah and to see the parallels to how God and Christ himself have responded. In just a moment, we're going to come together in song again. And I want to encourage you that if you have unwelcome, just negative change, or there's something that you are wrestling through and you thought, I've been mourning and I need someone to mourn with me. Or I've been mourning, but I'm ready to begin asking God for what the next step is, but you're not sure how to do it. There are plenty of elders and deacons and people in this church who would love to sit with you and to pray with you and help you out. So if that is something that you are looking for, I invite you to come forward as we stand and as we sing.